she didn't. Not that she wasn't proficient. Need a rose frame? She knew the stitch for that. A pansy border? She could create one without needing any sort of pattern. In 8 colours. But part of the reason she'd run away from home at 17 was a decided distaste for anything involving needles. So how could she have ended up here, more than 2 years later, in the drawing-room of Lady Something or other, bending her head over an embroidery frame, in less than willing imitation of all the other young ladies in attendance? Oh, right, because she was supposedly being sponsored at court, and her sponsor believed it would be beneficial for her to polish up her public persona. Batrice couldn't have disagreed more. There was nothing wrong with her personality, thank you, or her accomplishments. She'd suffered through 5 years of an exacting governess, and was perfectly adequate at etiquette and all of the other traditional skills. Or had been, she reflected, as her needle stabbed into the tip of her index finger for the 3rd time that afternoon. Besides, her sponsor was actually supposed to be giving her spy lessons, or whatever it was called when one was in training to become a secret agent of the Crown. Batrice hadn't expected it to be all thrills and excitement all the time, but was it too much to expect at least a few thrills, or even the tiniest of intrigues? Thus far, her lessons seemed to consist primarily of learning to convince the world that she was the least interesting person alive, which required a temporary return to the incredibly dull life of a debutante. A life that Batrice thought she'd left behind when she ran away from home and became an actress. As she muttered a decidedly unladylike word under her breath, Batrice glanced around the drawing-room and almost giggled when she encountered at least 2 other rebellious glances. Miss Coraline Smythe was stabbing her needle through her work as though determined to commit murder by silken thread, and Zolander Fidgins had spent the past hour pulling out 1 stitch at a time with glacial slowness. As Zolander was quite sprightly in all other circumstances, Batrice reasoned that it was likely a ruse, and she wasn't the only one wishing she were elsewhere. It wasn't likely, though, that either Coraline or Zolander had considered the consequences should they suddenly flip off their chairs and walk across the room on their hands. In Batrice's experience, acrobatics wasn't something young ladies thought about with much regularity, and the general reluctance of society to celebrate such talents had made it difficult to find much time to practice since she'd arrived in Avonlea. Her mentor had assured her that this process of deception, of pretending to be a proper debutante, was necessary. To be an effective agent, Batrice would need to be reconciled with both her family and with society as a whole. Such connections would supposedly provide her with the perfect cover for future activities, but Batrice wasn't at all convinced that her mentor's reassurances were more than a load of complete twaddle. The drawing-room door opened, and Batrice looked up from her work once more, hoping to find that it was finally time for tea. But no, an overfed and over-enthusiastic lapdog entered the room, panting and drooling on the carpet as it tugged on its leash in an effort to reach Lady... what was her name again? The dog was followed by a neatly starched servant, who observed its behaviour with a slightly curled lip, waiting only for the mistress of the house to cease fawning over his furry charge before he bent to pick it up and, theoretically, remove it from the room. The dog, sensing an end to its fun, neatly eluded the servant's grasp and took off in a circle, wrapping his leash around the man's ankles and bringing him crashing to the ground. A chorus of gasps erupted. "I'm so sorry," her hostess started to say, but to Batrice's delight it was much too late for sorry. As the fallen servant muttered a decidedly impolite word, the startled dog began to pull away from the scene of its crime, and as its ruffled collar was entirely too loose, it soon slipped off, leaving the delighted canine to race around the room, barking madly while careening into furniture, embroidery baskets, and ladies' skirts as its claws slipped on the polished floor. Gasps became shrieks, young ladies jumped to their feet, and embroidery frames were flung aside as 2 decorative tables went flying, accompanied by the sound of shattering porcelain. It was the most fun she'd had in weeks, Batrice decided, as she observed the proceedings with a broad grin. The flushed servant scrambled to his feet while the lady of the house split her phrases between berating him and calling futilely for her darling Bitsy to "stop running about and be a good boy for Mumsy. Won't you, lovey?" It was in the midst